The transit should have been clean. Atlantis had been running on 3 ZPMs since the battle over Earth, all systems nominal. The star drive threading the city along the same subspace corridor it had used to cross between galaxies twice before. The Pegasus galaxy was 9 days out. 9 days of quiet, 9 days for 200 combat-hardened people to begin the long work of counting what the war had taken. 9 days of something that might eventually become rest. Shepard felt the wrong thing before the alarms. The ATA gene was not radar, not radio. But where other people felt the city's distress through sound and light, the Colonel felt it through something older and more personal. A signal arriving not through his ears, but through the interface between a human nervous system. The star drive was pulling, not failing, not stalling, pulling sideways, across a geometry that had no name in the ancient navigation archive and no counterpart in any physics Shepard had been trained to understand. He hit the emergency interrupt. The city registered the command, then it continued falling. Anyway, the hyperspace corridor came apart around Atlantis like a cloth pulled from under a set table, too fast and too total. The city's systems logged the event calmly, without the editorial that this was the end of all useful plans. Environmental stable, shields nominal, structural integrity holding, ZPM output steady at maximum across all 3 modules. The drones on all 3 peer platforms stayed live, which was what mattered most, because the Lieutenant Colonel had not yet determined whether anything on the other side of wherever this was would be friendly. The transit lasted 2 seconds or 2 eternities, depending on the frame of reference. Then normal space. The impact was physical. A shudder moved through Atlantis, from the ocean-facing hull to the top of the central spire, felt by 200 people simultaneously in their feet, their chairs, their hands, on their instruments. The snowflake geometry of the city ship absorbed the event and held. The shields were up, the lights were on. The ancient architecture declined to collapse, because it had been built by people who had already survived more than this and gone somewhere past the need for survival. Then, silence, complete and new. "Contact report," Shepard said. Mackay's voice came back in 3 seconds, which meant he had been running data before Shepard asked. "No Wraith signatures anywhere in sensor range. No Naquadah, no Goa'uld technology. Nothing in the ancient stellar database matches any of these stars." A pause that was not dramatic, because Mackay's pauses were never dramatic, only dense. "We're not in Pegasus. We're not in the Milky Way. We are somewhere the ancients never mapped. In 5 years of arriving in places no human being had been meant to reach. Shepard had developed a functional tolerance for, we have no idea where we are. He processed the information, filed it in the category of things he could not immediately solve, and moved to the next question. Threats, working on that. From the doorway of the operations room, Ronan said nothing. He did not need to. The particle gun was already in his hand, resting at his side at the precise angle that meant he had evaluated the environment and found it suspect, but not yet confirmed hostile. Taylor stood at the center of the room and looked at nothing the instruments could show her. She was not looking at the starfield. She was listening to the frequencies the city's communications array was cataloging, and something in the texture of them pressed against a scent she could not name. The overhead sensor display had already populated with Mackay's first sweep. The star pattern bore no relationship to any catalog aboard the city ship. The ancient archive covered 2 galaxies across 10,000 years. Every star within reach of every survey mission the ancients had ever run had an entry. None of what Shepard was looking at had one. Outside the tower windows, a star field burned in the absolute uncharted dark of a galaxy nobody in this city had ever crossed. 3 of the piers extended from the central spire in the post-transit silence, the snowflake arms of Atlantis holding position in space that did not know its name. The lights burned along each pier. Everything intact, everything running. Shepard had no theory yet about who had done this, but something had been present in the corridor, not watching from outside it. Present inside the transit geometry itself, the way gravity is present everywhere it acts without asking permission. Whatever it was had registered the ZPM signature during the crossing, some appraisal running beneath the event rather than above it. An intelligence determining what it had found and whether what it had found was interesting enough to act on. The presence had not attacked, had not warned, had simply decided, and then it was gone, and Atlantis was here, and Shepard was alone in it, with 200 people, and a city full of weapons he had not yet had to fire. All right, I genuinely have to know, before we go any further. Which character do you want to see dropped into a universe that is absolutely not ready for them? Throw a name in the comments. Okay, here we go. McKay's second report came 5 minutes later. His voice carried the register of a man who was simultaneously furious and fascinated by the same fact, which was, in McKay's case, the clearest signal that what he had found was genuinely significant. Artificial objects at warp-capable scale, nearest system, multiple vessels, moving at faster-than-light velocities, but not through a hyperspace window, completely different mechanism. These ships don't punch a hole in space and jump through it, they curve it. Something about the geometry of local space-time. A pause. The ancient censors are trying to build a glossary entry for the FTL interaction. You want to know which word keeps coming up? Shepard waited. Subspace. Not as an anomaly, as an engineering concept. Whoever these ships belong to, they use subspace the way we use Naquadah. It's infrastructure. McKay's voice had gone flat, which for McKay meant something between awe and genuine alarm. They're going to have detected us, an energy event this size, in what has apparently been quiet space. Unknown, Shepard said. Yes, unknown. That's exactly the problem. Shepard looked at the starfield for 10 seconds. Ronan had not lowered the particle gun. Taylor had not moved. McKay was already running a second pass on the sensor data, building a picture of a galaxy that had physics in common with home and almost nothing else he recognized. The city had a cloak. Full concealment tested against every sensor the Wraith had ever fielded. In Pegasus, arriving cloaked in unknown space was an act of war. Not because concealment was inherently hostile, but because a cloaked ship that was eventually found, and in Shepard's experience it was always eventually found, had already been lying. The first hostile choice had been made before a single weapon was raised, before anyone on either side had the opportunity to be anything other than an enemy. 5 years of that, math had produced a rule. Shepard kept it even when keeping it cost him the advantage of surprise. He held position. Shields at maximum. Drones at standby. All 3 pier platforms elevated and ready, not aimed. The city hung in the dark of an unknown galaxy. 4 kilometers of ancient engineering running hot and quiet and prepared for whatever came next. Somewhere out there, along the vector, the sensors had already begun plotting. Something moved at warp speed and had not yet decided what to make of a 4-kilometer structure that had materialized from nowhere, raised no weapons, and refused to disappear. The stars didn't offer an opinion in Shepard's experience. They never did. 3 light-years from the Devron system, in the approach to the Romulan neutral zone, the Enterprise D's long-range sensor array logged an event it had no category for. The alert arrived at the tactical station first, because new contacts in contested border space always arrived at the tactical station first. Lieutenant Commander Worf processed it in under 2 seconds, cross-referenced it against every vessel classification in the Federation database, and reported to the bridge with the particular economy of a Klingon who had already formed an assessment and was waiting for authorization to act on it. Unknown subspace transit event. Estimated structure. Diameter 4 kilometers. Power output anomalous at all measured scales. No Federation classification. Captain Jean-Luc Picard read the preliminary data from his command chair. He called Red Alert in the 14th second. Plot an intercept course. Best speed. He was already on his feet, which was not standard procedure, and which his first officer recognized as the sign that Picard had already decided what kind of situation this was. Open a long-range channel on all standard hailing frequencies. "We do not go in with weapons armed, Captain," Worf said, in the tone that meant he disagreed but was not yet making it a formal objection. "Not until we know what we're looking at, Mr. Worf." The Enterprise came out of warp at visual range, and what the main view screen resolved was not a ship, it was a city. 4 kilometers of alien architecture extended across the stars in a geometry that had no counterpart in any known species engineering tradition. 3 great arms reaching from a central spire, the whole structure, the light of a building occupied by people rather than a machine in motion. The platforms on the structure's 3 piers were unmistakably weapons systems. They were active. They were not aimed. Sensor analysis, Picard said. Lieutenant Commander Data's hands moved across his console. Then they stopped. 3 seconds passed. On a bridge, where the crew had served with the android for years, 3 seconds of motionless silence from Data was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. It was the longest he had needed to normalize a sensor read in anyone's memory. When he spoke, his voice carried the precise neutrality of a scientist presenting a result he had not been able to verify to his own satisfaction. The structure is approximately 4.1 kilometers in diameter. Hull material composition does not correspond to any alloy in Federation archives or any alien technology catalog aboard. The power source is drawing from vacuum energy zero-point fluctuations. The Federation has theoretical models for this type of power generation. No civilization in this galaxy has been recorded achieving the engineering application. The observed output exceeds our most powerful warp cores by a factor I cannot accurately calculate because I cannot calibrate our instruments to a power source of this type. Riker looked at Picard. Picard had not looked away from the view screen. "The weapons platforms," Worf said. 3 active emplacements. Targeting systems are live." His voice was controlled, but the implication sat in the air above the bridge like a barometric reading. They could not scan through the structure's hull. They had no tactical history on it. "I recommend we establish a lock." "We have not been fired upon, Mr. Worf. Not yet." "Not yet," Picard said quietly, "which tells us something." He turned from the view screen, and his expression was the one Riker had learned to read across 6 years as his first officer, the expression of a man who had already decided and was prepared to spend whatever it cost him. A structure that could have fired in the first 30 seconds and chose not to has a reason to hold. I want to know that reason before we give anyone aboard a cause to reconsider it. He looked at Worf. "Hold our position. Phasers powered." Not Hot Counselor Troi had not spoken since the view screen resolved. She closed her eyes. Troi was half Betazoid. In practical terms, that meant she received the emotions of the people around her, the way other people received temperature as direct physical information rather than inference from behavior. She had learned, over years, to narrow that sensitivity rather than absorb everything at once. She narrowed it now and reached across the 3 kilometers of space between the Enterprise and the unknown structure, and she did not find what she had been bracing for. What she found was human grief. Human grief itself, in quantity and texture, she recognized from the worst moments of her own service. The bone-deep exhaustion of people who had been living in mortal danger long enough that danger had become their baseline. What the structure was broadcasting across open space was the emotional signature of a crew that had survived something they had not expected to survive, and were now running on the durable endurance of soldiers who had stopped expecting to be allowed to stop. "Captain," she said. Her voice was steady. Her voice was always steady. "That is a human crew. They are frightened, and they are grateful, and they have been through something I cannot name from here. There is no malice in them." She opened her eyes. "None," Picard said. "Open a hailing frequency." The channel opened. Neither side spoke for a full 3 seconds, and the silence was not empty. What the open channel transmitted before anyone said a word was the ambient noise of 2 crises happening simultaneously in the same frequency band, and what came back from the structure was English. Recognizable in the first instant, and then almost immediately not, because the vocabulary threaded through it had no Federation referent. The words were human, the compound terms they formed were not. ZPM, ATA gene, Wraith, chevron sequence. The universal translator parsed them phonetically, flagged each as unresolvable, and moved on. On the other end of the channel, Shepard was having the same problem from the other direction. The hail was structured like a military communication, delivered by a commanding officer whose register Shepard recognized the way he recognized any CO's voice. The compression of a person who understood that every word in a first contact transmission. The words he understood. The institutional framework around them was completely alien. Starfleet, Prime Directive, General Order 1. He knew what Red Alert meant. He knew what it meant when someone on the other end of a channel was choosing their words that carefully. He had been in that conversation before, in a galaxy where the wrong answer meant his city burned. He opened a return channel. "This is Lieutenant Colonel John Shepard, military commander of the city ship Atlantis. We are not hostile, we are stranded. We do not know how we arrived at these coordinates, and we are not able to leave without at least your patience." 5 years had made his voice flat in exactly this kind of moment. "We have not fired on you. We are not going to fire on you. I am asking the same courtesy in return." He stopped. Added one thing more, because it was the one true thing he had to offer. "We're from Earth." The words landed across 3 kilometers of space. Worf's hands stilled on the tactical console. Riker's jaw tightened once, very slightly, the first officer running the numbers on what it meant if the claim was accurate. Troy said quietly, "True, every word of it." Picard addressed the open channel. He did not use a diplomatic register or a tactical register. He used the voice he had used in 35 years of hard conversations, the one that was neither calculated nor formal, but simply honest. "Then come in out of the cold, Colonel. We have a great deal to discuss." The channel held. Neither ship moved. The weapons platforms on the 4-kilometer structure remained at standby. The Enterprise's phasers remained powered and untargeted. On both bridges, across 2 different frameworks for what a moment like this signified, the same understanding arrived simultaneously. They were not going to shoot each other. Not today. The order from Starfleet Command arrived via subspace relay. 40 minutes after first contact, and it was, from a procedural standpoint, entirely correct. The first contact protocol for an unidentified structure of unknown defensive capability included a baseline weapons response test, a single calibration shot at minimum power, targeted at the structure's outermost pier to establish whether its defensive systems were active and what class of response they generated. Not a hostile act, a measurement. Starfleet had conducted more than 300 first contact events in its history. The majority of them had included a calibration shot. The data was consistently useful. Picard read the order, confirmed receipt, and turned to his tactical officer. "Minimum power, Mr. Worf." The outermost port pier, Worf fired. The phaser beam left the Enterprise at the lowest powered setting, above standby, a thread of coherent energy traveling across 3 kilometers of space at light speed. It struck the outer surface of Atlantis' shields and stopped. Not deflected, not scattered, not absorbed with any measurable resistance. The beam hit the shield boundary and stopped existing. On the Enterprise bridge, Lieutenant Commander Data processed the result for 2.3 seconds before speaking. That pause alone told the bridge crew something. No shield degradation detected, impact energy absorbed entirely. Margin of error, 0. He turned from his console. "Captain, the shield surface did not register the beam as a contact event. There is no record in the structure's sensor data that we fired. The bridge absorbed this in silence." "Not as something to deflect," Riker said. "Not as something to notice," Data replied. Picard looked at the tactical display. 3 kilometers away, the city sat in exactly the posture it had maintained since their arrival, shields at full. Weapons at standby. Nothing changing. On Atlantis, the shield status board was blank, for the same reason. The ancient sensor array had catalogued the phaser beam's energy output against the shield's operational parameters and classified it below the reporting threshold. Ancient shields had been built to withstand the weapons of the Goa'uld and the Wraith. Civilizations whose firepower scaled to the level of capital ship ordnance, hundreds of hive ships, thousands of weapons discharges sustained bombardment across hours of battle. A single Starfleet phaser beam, at minimum power, fell below the floor of those specifications by a margin the sensors did not bother to express as a number. The shield had absorbed it the way a lake absorbs a stone. McKay looked at his sensor readout, then at the result, then back at the readout. Then he laughed. It came out as a sound under significant pressure, half relief, and half the specific release of someone who had been carrying a quiet, unexamined fear about whether the city's shields would hold against technology they had never encountered. Shepard heard in it the answer to a question McKay had not asked out loud since the city arrived in this unknown galaxy. These ships were real. Their weapons functioned. Against these shields they did not function enough. "They can't touch us," McKay said. He was not grinning. He was doing something that would eventually become grinning if he let it. "They cannot touch this city, McKay. I know. He brought it back under control. Professional, yes, I know." The second order from Starfleet Command arrived in the following minute. Increase to mid-range phaser power and repeat the calibration test. The logic was sound. If the first shot had been below threshold, a higher power beam would give comparative data. Picard relayed it. Worf fired. The result was identical. Not a partial reflection, not a scatter pattern. The higher-powered beam ceased to exist at the shield boundary with the same completeness as the first. Worf stood at his tactical console, with his hands flat on the surface and his expression held in the professional stillness He had trained himself to maintain in situations where the data was telling him something he needed time to fully absorb. Riker watched the stillness happen. He had served with Worf long enough to recognize the difference between composed and recalculating. This was the second one. On the Enterprise's tactical display, 3 weapons platforms on Atlantis's outermost piers began to move. The platforms rose from passive standby to active configuration slowly, each one extending to its full deployment posture with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a mechanism that had done this many times before and had no interest in being mistaken for something it was not. The drone emplacements were now visible as the raised, aimed structures they were. "Full weapons lock," Worf said. "Prepare to fire. Hold," Picard said. On Atlantis, the sequence had a designation the expedition had assigned after their 3rd encounter in Pegasus, with a ship that interpreted restraint as weakness. When a vessel fired on the city twice, Standard Contact Protocol Delta required showing the weapons, not firing them. A demonstration, not an attack. The drone platforms deployed to full configuration and stopped there, standing open and visible and unmistakably armed. The message was not hostility. The message was geometry. These are the weapons this city carries. These are what you are deciding to fire on again. Shepard stood in the operations room, watching the deployment complete on the status board. Are they locking targeting solutions? McKay ran the sensor data. No. They're calculating, not aiming, different posture entirely. They're going to fire again, maybe. McKay pulled up the tactical display. Or maybe they'll stop, because someone over there is doing the math on what would happen if we opened those drone bays all the way. He looked up. Should I put the city in firing stance? Let them see the full count. Shepard looked at the Enterprise for 4 seconds. Then he closed the drone deployment sequence. All 3 platforms pulled back to standby. He turned to the pilot at the secondary console. Get me a jumper, unarmed, cloak off. Pilot visible through the forward canopy. Sir, I'm going myself. The puddle jumper cleared the hangar bay at low speed and crossed 3 kilometers of open space at a pace slow enough to be read as intentional by any sensor system in range. It was a small, ancient-built shuttle, compact enough to fly through a Stargate with no weapons emitter active and no energy charged for anything other than propulsion and life support. It came to a stop 200 meters from the Enterprise's forward hull and held position there, then opened a broadcast on every frequency the ancient array could reach. An open microphone. No encryption, no targeting data. Shepard's voice came through the channel, flat and precise. We're not here to fight. I just need you to stop shooting at my city. On the Enterprise bridge, no one spoke for 3 seconds. Captain, Riker said. Picard said, power down all weapons, not to standby, not to low readiness. Down. A complete, deliberate shutdown, the full reciprocal of what the city had just done across 3 kilometers of space. Riker looked at him. A crew that could have fired back, Picard said, and chose instead to send a single pilot in an unarmed ship with an open microphone, has a reason not to escalate. That reason is worth knowing. Worf said nothing for 11 seconds. Picard had learned in 6 years of serving with the lieutenant commander that a silence of more than 5 seconds in a tactical situation meant Worf was running a calculation he had not yet decided to voice. At 11 seconds he decided. If those weapons platforms had been fully deployed, Captain, Worf said, our shields would not have held. Picard looked at him steadily. I know. They knew that too. Yes, Picard said, they did. The jumper held position 200 meters off the Enterprise's forward hull, broadcasting silence and presence in equal measure. The city held its position 3 kilometers out, full shields up, all weapons stood down, everything powered and nothing aimed. No fight had happened. That was the demonstration. The subspace report took Picard 40 minutes to write, because he was not willing to write a shorter one. He had been present at more first contact events than almost any other officer in active Starfleet service, and he had developed across those events a particular discipline about precision, because a report that simplified a contact for the benefit of the reader inevitably shaped the policy response in ways the contact itself had not warranted. He used specific facts. Unknown city ship, 4.1 kilometers in diameter, materialized from a subspace transit event with no detectable origin point. Human crew, self-identified as originating in a parallel dimensional continuum. Technology exceeding all engineering baselines in Federation archives. Power source operating on zero-point vacuum energy extraction with no analog in known physics. No hostile action at any point of the encounter. A crew that had been fired upon twice demonstrated weapons capable of ending the engagement, and responded instead by sending an unarmed pilot on an open broadcast frequency to ask them to stop. Starfleet Command's response arrived within the hour. The Federation Council had been briefed. The decision was as follows. The structure was to be impounded pending full technology assessment. The crew was to be confined aboard the Enterprise while a security team was transported to the city for inspection of systems and databases. The response was signed by 2 admirals and a council liaison, and it was written in the careful, comprehensive language of institutional authority, which was the language of people who had not been present and had decided anyway. Picard read the order. He set it aside. He transmitted back. His counter-argument was 6 sentences, chosen with care. The city's shields, he wrote, could not be breached by available Starfleet hardware. This was not a strategic assessment. He had tested it twice, and both tests had produced the same result, 0 effect. An impoundment order that could not be enforced was worse than no order, because it communicated to the Atlantis crew the Federation's first instinct toward a stranded human crew with superior technology. That information, conveyed to people who had just chosen cooperation over hostility twice, would guarantee the hostility that 2 hours of careful handling had so far prevented. He requested authorization to proceed diplomatically. Starfleet Command's reply took 42 minutes. It did not authorize him. It did not override him. He proceeded. The Atlantis crew had never used a transporter. The technology did not exist in their universe. The Stargate program used wormhole transit through a network of ring-shaped portals built by the ancients and seeded across 2 galaxies 10,000 years ago. For everything a Stargate could not reach. Nothing in their operational history prepared them for what Starfleet considered a routine dematerialization cycle. Shepard handled it by going first. He had developed across 5 years of leading people into situations with no established survival data. The practice of demonstrating that a thing did not kill him before asking anyone else to do it. He stepped onto the transporter pad, held eye contact with McKay for approximately 1 second, and was briefly not anywhere. Then he was in the transporter room on the Enterprise, and the light was different, and the floor vibrated at a frequency Atlantis never did, and he was entirely whole, which was the important thing. Rhiannon came through behind him with his hand on his particle gun. He did not draw it. The distinction was precise and intentional, the Satadan equivalent of showing your palms, armed but not raising. He scanned the room in the order a soldier scans an unknown space, exits, corners, elevation. He found Data standing near the far wall and spent 2 additional seconds on him. Taylor came through next. Mackay materialized last with his tablet already active, pulling readings on the transporter room's power signature. He got 3 seconds of data before Data spoke. "You are from a parallel dimensional continuum," Data said. He had not opened with a greeting, because the most useful thing he could offer was not a greeting. "Your power source operates on principles that are theoretically derivable from Federation physics, but have no engineering analog in this universe." The gold eyes moved from the tablet to Mackay's face. "I find this extremely interesting." Mackay looked at him, the stillness of a body that had no biological processes to compensate for. The phrasing calibrated for information density rather than social function. He looked at Data for a moment. "Are you an android?" "I am," Data said. "Good," Mackay said, "because I have approximately 800 questions, and humans get tired." The formal briefing ran 2 hours in the Enterprise's main conference room, and 2 hours was not enough. Picard and Shepard ran it together, and for the first 15 minutes they ran it as 2 separate briefings, until the room arrived at the collective understanding that the fastest way to cover mutual ground was to let people interrupt. Both sides had warp-capable civilizations. Both sides had encountered near-omnipotent energy beings who had chosen a policy of non-interference. The similarity ended there and did not resume. The idea of a pre-existing transit network, ring-shaped portals built and seeded across 2 galaxies by a civilization that had peaked 10,000 years before either present civilization existed, required a pause in the Enterprise crew's collective processing that was visible across the table. They had the concept for ancient precursor civilizations. They had no concept for a precursor civilization that had left functioning infrastructure. The Atlantis crew had no concept for a post-scarcity economy that did not depend on a controlled power source. They had spent 5 years rationing ZPM energy the way other civilizations ration food. The idea of matter replication at industrial scale arrived in Mackay's face as an expression he did not organize into words. He wrote something on his tablet and did not look up for 90 seconds. Picard described the queue. Shepard described the ascended ancients. Both sides recognized in the other's description the same texture of frustration. Beings who could end a crisis declining to do so, on principle, for reasons they declined to share. Picard's crew recognized it from years of Q encounters. Shepard's crew recognized it from 5 years of asking the ancients to return and being told in various indirect ways that the ancients had moved past caring whether the people they had left behind in Pegasus survived. Taylor said, quietly, from her chair near the viewport, "Perhaps all universes make their gods the same shape." No one had a better answer than that. The briefing moved on. Worf found Renan in the corridor outside the briefing room while both their commanding officers were still at the table. They stood in the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, but was not friendly either. The silence of 2 people who had been measuring each other since the transporter room and had not finished. "You have fought this creature," Worf said, "the Wraith, for 5 years. They hunted me alone for 7 before that," Renan said. "No weapon drops, no backup. One at a time, they send another one. They call it sport." Worf was quiet for a moment. The corridor light ran steady and even. "Klingons have a word," Worf said, "for a warrior who survives a hunt that is supposed to be unwinnable." He said the word. It was a short Klingon syllable with an aspirated stop in it, and a weight that did not translate phonetically. Ronan did not know it. He did not ask what it meant. Worf did not translate it. The tone was the translation, and Ronan registered it the way a person registers a thing they had not expected to receive. He stood with it for a moment. 7 years is a long time," Ronan said. Yes, Worf said. It is. The second message from Starfleet Command was waiting when Picard returned to the bridge. The language was firmer. The Council liaison signature had been replaced by an Admiral's, which was the institutional version of raising a voice. The impoundment order was restated. The timeline for compliance was now explicit. Picard read it at his command chair, with the city ship visible on the view screen 3 kilometers off the port bow, its lights burning along all 3 piers, its shields holding, its weapons at standby, everything powered, nothing aimed. He filed a receipt acknowledgement, which confirmed the message had arrived and said nothing else. He gave himself 24 more hours. Picard spent 8 hours with the briefing materials before he found Shepard. He read what the Atlantis expedition had done in Pegasus. Not the summary version Shepard had offered in the conference room, the operational outline with the enemy identified and the objectives stated, but the underlying record, what they had actually done, year by year, in a galaxy full of human populations. They had armed pre-warp civilizations, distributed ancient technology to societies that had no framework for it, conducted offensive military operations against the Wraith, which was not a defensive action taken to protect themselves, but a sustained attempt to change the strategic balance of a galaxy that had developed its own balance over 10 millennia, intervened in conflicts that were not theirs. Picard was not angry when he finished reading. He was precise. He found Shepard on the observation deck of Atlantis's central tower, standing at the railing above the city's outstretched arms, with the stars of an unknown galaxy burning across the full width of the viewport behind him. The observation deck was built for this. The railing ran the full circumference of the aperture, and the city's 3 piers extended below like the spokes of something that had once known exactly where it was going. The colonel did not look surprised to see Picard there. He looked like a man who had been expecting a specific conversation and had decided to have it standing up. "You've read the whole thing," Shepard said. "I have," Picard said. Both of them understood without discussing it that the conversation they were about to have did not belong in a briefing room. This was not a debrief. It was something that required altitude. What the expedition did in Pegasus, Picard said, was not exploratory science. It was intervention by a more powerful civilization in the development of civilizations. He stood beside Shepard at the railing and looked at the city below, the 3 piers, the lights. "I'm not pretending the Wraith are not a horror. I'm making a harder argument. The Wraith evolved in the Pegasus galaxy. They have as much right to exist there as the humans they feed on. That is the logic on which the Prime Directive is built, and it is not comfortable logic, but its discomfort does not make it wrong." The expedition did not ask whether their intervention would ultimately do more harm than good. They assumed it would do good. Every empire in history has assumed the same thing. Shepard did not respond immediately. He was not the kind of man who responded to an argument he had not finished hearing. Picard had seen enough command styles to recognize the difference between someone who was formulating a counter-argument and someone who was waiting to make sure the argument had finished. Shepard was the second kind. Picard waited. "I want to describe something specific," Shepard said. "There's a planet. I'm not going to name it because that opens something I don't have time for right now. But it exists and it's in our briefing record, and you can read the coordinates when we're done here." His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had made a decision about how to carry a memory and was holding to it. "We arrived 12 hours after a culling. The Wraith feed through their palm. They lay it against a person's chest and drain the years out. Minutes for a full feed. What they leave behind is a body that died of old age, at whatever age the person was when they were touched, except they weren't old. They were 20. They were 40. They were children old enough to walk, but not old enough to run fast enough. He turned from the railing. Here's the question I need you to answer, and I need the actual answer, not the diplomatic version. If you had been 12 hours earlier, what would the Prime Directive have told you to do? Picard was silent for a moment. It would have told me not to intervene, he said. Then your directive, Shepard said, is built on the assumption that there is something natural and developmental about being farmed alive, and I don't accept that premise. Picard looked at him. The flatness was not a performance. It was the tone of a man who had arrived at this position by a route that had cost him something and was not going to apologize for having arrived there. I understand the argument, Picard said. I am making a different one. He turned back to the railing. The expedition's intervention did not save Pegasus. The Wraiths still exist. The culling continued. Human worlds were still being harvested while you fought. What you changed, at the cost of years and lives, and the sustained violation of civilization's right to their own development, was the degree of suffering, not the fact of it. The Wraith problem was Pegasus's problem, and you imported it here. He let that sit for a moment. The ZPM subspace resonance from this city's power systems has already registered in the sensor arrays of something in this galaxy. I have not yet told you what that something is, but I am going to, and when I do, you will understand that the problem you brought with you has the potential to cost this universe more than the problem you were running from cost Pegasus. That's not my fault, Shepard said. The transit wasn't voluntary. I know, Picard said. I am not assigning fault. I am describing a pattern. Well-intentioned outsiders with superior power arrive in a situation that is not theirs. They improve the situation, by their own metrics, for the people they have chosen to help, at costs they were not positioned to fully calculate, and they bring their problems with them. The pattern is very old. The question is whether this universe can afford the expedition's problems. Shepard was quiet. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who had been having this argument internally for long enough that the external version was almost a formality. You're describing a choice between the cost of acting and the cost of not acting, he said, and presenting inaction as if it doesn't have a cost. People died while we decided. People died while we planned. Every time. He stopped, started again. The thing I can't explain to you, Captain, is what 5 years of that math does to you. You stop asking whether you had the right. You start asking whether the person next to you is still breathing. Neither man spoke for a while. After that, the city spread below them in the dark, 3 kilometers of ancient engineering holding position in the gravity of a star that did not know its name. The lights burned along all 3 piers. Somewhere in the architecture below, McKay and Data were building a shared language out of physics. Somewhere in a corridor near the guest quarters, Renan was doing what Renan did in unfamiliar places, which was stand in a corner with his hand near his weapon and watch every person who walked past with the attention of a man who had been hunted long enough to make vigilance into something indistinguishable from rest. The planet Picard's universe had built its moral architecture on was somewhere behind the stars at his back. The planet Shepard's expedition had been trying to return to was in a different galaxy, in a different universe, an infinite distance in a direction that physics had not yet given a name. Both men stayed at the railing. Neither had convinced the other. Neither had expected to. McKay's terms for giving Data access to the Atlantis science lab had been simple. Supervised access meant McKay was in the room. Data had accepted this without objection and without apparent awareness that he was supposed to find it insulting. That, McKay thought, was already promising. The lab occupied a corner of Atlantis's main science deck, a broad room of ancient crystal matrix consoles and indirect lighting that had been active for 10,000 years before the expedition arrived, and had never stopped. Data stood across the central bench from McKay, the contents of a Starfleet field science kit, arranged with geometric precision on one end and McKay's own array of diagnostic tools on the other. They had spent the first 20 minutes attempting to connect a Federation isolinear chip reader to an ancient data crystal interface. The architectures were not merely incompatible, they operated on entirely different physical principles. Trying to bridge them directly was the equivalent of solving an equation in a language that did not have the right numbers. They had arrived at the same conclusion independently, and at approximately the same moment, which was the first sign in McKay's experience of a scientist worth talking to. Physics, McKay said. First principles, Data said. If the math is the same in both universes, McKay said, and it has to be, because otherwise we would not have been able to exist simultaneously in this one, then the engineering choices are what diverge. We find the physics they share and work backward from both ends. That is precisely the methodology I had concluded was necessary, Data said. I find it encouraging that you arrived at it independently. I find it encouraging that you arrived at it at all, McKay said. I've been in rooms with a lot of scientists. Most of them would have spent another week trying to make the reader's interface. He put a ZPM on the bench. The module was the size of a large vase and had the particular visual quality of ancient construction, asymmetric organic curves in a material that was not quite glass and not quite metal, lit from within by a faint blue luminescence that did not pulse or flicker, a steady output that had been maintaining that exact frequency for roughly 10 millennia. It had been the backup from Atlantis's secondary coupling array. It was, by any reasonable metric, the most advanced single piece of technology in the room, possibly in the sector. 0-point module, McKay said. The ancients figured out how to draw energy from the quantum vacuum state of a small isolated region of subspace. You're pulling from 0-point energy fluctuations at the base level of space-time. In theory, you can keep drawing indefinitely, because the quantum vacuum is not a reservoir that empties. It is a state, 10,000 years old. Still running, 3 of them power this city. Data stood motionless for a period of time that McKay measured against his own heartbeat. 40 seconds, approximately. The longest silence Data had produced in McKay's presence. Federation physics has a theoretical model for 0-point energy extraction, Data said. The engineering application has never been achieved. The prevailing assessment is that the vacuum fluctuations occur too rapidly and at scales too small to harvest at any useful efficiency. The engineering tolerances required were considered to exceed what was physically achievable. The ancients disagreed, McKay said. Data looked at the ZPM for another few seconds. The ancients, he said, were significantly more capable than any civilization in this galaxy. Yeah, McKay said, we know. It's a whole thing. In exchange, because this was already, without either of them having agreed to it, a conversation that ran on exchange, Data opened the Enterprise's Borg Encounter Archive on a portable display unit. I am sharing these records with Picard's authorization, Data said, because the ZPM subspace resonance represents a potential detection event that you need to understand in full context. The Borg are the relevant context. McKay looked at the display. He worked from the tactical summary first, the way he always worked, the numbers before the narrative, because numbers did not have the same capacity for horror as narrative, and he needed the scale before he could handle the texture. 1 Borg cube, 39 Starfleet vessels, 11,000 dead. He read the casualty figure twice. Then he read the engagement duration and divided the first number by the second. He had spent 5 years fighting the Wraith. He knew what it felt like to look at a weapon system that did not care about the cost, that assimilated everything it encountered and adapted and came back. The Wraith were not the Borg. The mechanism was completely different. The Wraith fed on life. The Borg converted it. But the shape of the threat had the same bone structure, a collective that catalogued you before. It consumed you, that adapted to whatever you used to stop it, that viewed your civilization as a resource to be processed rather than an opponent to be defeated. McKay knew that shape from the inside. He had been living inside it for 5 years. "How did you stop one cube?" he said. "We have not always stopped them," Data said. McKay looked at the casualty figure a third time. 39 ships, 1 cube. "Yes," Data said. "And the Borg," McKay said slowly, "catalog new energy sources, because cataloging is the first step before assimilation." "Correct. A power signature with no existing classification is the highest priority detection category in Borg tactical protocol. An unknown energy source represents unknown technology. Unknown technology is assimilation priority." McKay looked at the ZBM on the bench. Then he looked at it as what it was. A 10,000-year-old device drawing energy from the vacuum state of subspace, broadcasting a resonance pattern that had no analog anywhere in this galaxy, in a sector that a Borg cube had potentially been passing through within sensor range. "Calculate the propagation rate," he said, "for a subspace anomaly at the ZPM's observed output. How far does it travel in 31 hours, and how long would it take something with the Borg sensor capability to detect it?" Data ran the calculation. It took him 4 seconds, which was slower than usual, which meant the uncertainty range was meaningful. If a Borg vessel was within standard tactical patrol range of this sector, the signal would have been detectable within 22 hours of Atlantis's emergence. We have been in this space for 31 hours. D. McKay sat with that for 12 seconds, which was 9 seconds longer than he needed to understand the implication, and 3 seconds of simply sitting with it anyway. "Right," he said. He closed the ZPN data file on his own console and stood. "I need to find Shepard." He picked up his tablet, moved toward the door, then stopped. "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with any of this data?" said. "Yes. Yes." "What is it like," McKay said, "to know everything you know, which is a lot, to be able to process every calculation anyone has handed you in the time it takes me to pick up a coffee, and to still be uncertain whether you matter?" Data considered the question with the same seriousness with which he considered a sensor reading. "I was uncertain for most of my existence," he said. The uncertainty was significant. It occupied considerable processing. "How did you stop being uncertain?" "I have not," Data said entirely, "but I found that the uncertainty was more useful than the resolution would have been. If I had resolved the question, I would have stopped asking it." Asking it seemed like the worse outcome. McKay stared at him for a long moment. "I'm going to think about that," McKay said. For several years he walked out. Data looked at the ZPM, still sitting in the center of the bench between 2 sets of instruments that could not speak to each other except through the shared language of mathematics. He picked up his own display unit and began drafting a secondary report for Picard, separate from the tactical summary concerned with a single variable. The signal had been broadcasting for 31 hours. The threshold had been 22. They had 9 hours of uncertainty left, at most, before the uncertainty resolved itself. The communique arrived with a Federation Council counter-signature, which meant it was no longer a recommendation. Picard read it at his captain's chair on a bridge that was maintaining the professional quiet of a crew that had learned, over 6 years together, when to give their commanding officer the space to process an order before responding to it. The document was precise and institutional. The Atlantis city ship was to be treated as an unregistered vessel of unknown origin, operating in Federation space without authorization. Its crew was to be confined to the Enterprise under Federation custody, pending full technology assessment. A Starfleet engineering team was authorized, at Picard's discretion, to take possession of the city and secure its systems for analysis. The Federation Council had countersigned. The authority was therefore not Starfleet's to question. Picard opened a channel to Atlantis. He read the order to Shepard without redaction and without framing. He did not soften it. He did not explain the political architecture behind it or contextualize the Council's position. He read the words as written, because Shepard was the commanding officer of what this document was describing, and he deserved to hear it in full. There was a silence on the other end of the channel when Picard finished. "We're not a vessel," Shepard said. His voice was flat and precise in a way that Picard recognized as the tone of a man who was choosing very carefully which words to put in what order. "We're a city. We're also the only thing standing between you and the fact that we have apparently flagged this sector to something you call the Borg, and I'm not surrendering this city to anyone. If you send a team across, they will not find the door open. The channel closed." On Atlantis, Shepard turned to the operations room and found McKay already running the numbers on his console, because McKay ran the numbers before anyone asked him to. "How long do we have?" Shepard said. McKay looked at the time readout and at the calculation he had run in the lab with data, which he had already updated with the current elapsed figure. 32 hours since emergence. Data's threshold was 22. So he looked up. Less than 2 hours maybe less, if there's a cube in the sector and its sensors are anything like the spec in Data's tactical files. We're already inside the detection window. Shepard said nothing. He looked at the view screen showing the Enterprise 3 kilometers off the port approach, its running lights steady, its weapons in the powered but not hot posture that had not changed since the second phaser calibration shot. "Don't lower the shield on the gate room," Shepard said. "Not yet. On the Enterprise." Worf had a security boarding team assembled within 12 minutes of the channel closing. 6 officers, full equipment, transporter coordinates for Atlantis's primary access corridor, calculated and ready. He did not brief them on what they would find at those coordinates, because he did not know, and briefing people on what they did not know was not a practice he found useful. He briefed them on what they were doing, securing an unknown vessel under Council-authorized order. Picard did not dispatch them. Riker found him in the corridor outside the bridge, which was where Picard went when he needed 30 seconds that were not on the record. "If we board that city," Riker said quietly, "we lose the one thing that stopped them from firing at us, which is that we haven't given them a reason to." "I know," Picard said. "Starfleet Command doesn't know what we know about those weapons. I know that too. And we have a sensor anomaly at long range. The data has not yet classified." Picard looked at him. "You've been talking to Data." "Data's been talking to everyone who will listen," Riker said. "It's his way of being concerned." Picard returned to the bridge. He opened a channel to Starfleet Command and requested a delay in the boarding action, citing an active sensor contact with an unknown approach vector that required his full attention before any further action could be taken. He was not lying. Data had flagged the anomaly 4 minutes ago. It was not confirmed. The signal was at the edge of long-range sensor resolution, ambiguous in classification, but present. The request was acknowledged. The delay was not officially granted. But Command would need time to formulate a response, and Picard intended to use that time. Taylor was in Atlantis' control room when the feeling arrived. It was not a thought. It was pressure, arriving in the specific register that her trace wraith heritage had always translated as proximity to a collective mind, the particular bone-deep resonance of a hive mind's coordination signal bleeding outward through space. She had felt wraith queens before. She had learned to breathe through the sensation, to keep herself separate from the signal while it moved through her, to use it as information without being used by it in return. This was not a wraith queen. It was colder than any wraith consciousness she had ever touched. Colder and more organized, a signal that did not have the biological hunger of the wraith running underneath it. No appetite, no cruelty, only the absolute mechanical certainty of a collective that had been assimilating things for longer than Taylor could comprehend the time scale of. The wraith were predators. This was something that had moved past predation into something she did not have a word for, something that processed. She found Shepard before the alarms reached the control room. "Something is coming," she said. "It has hurt us." She could not say more than that. The signal was already withdrawing as she reached for it, pulling back into itself as if aware that it had been felt. "It knows where we are." She did not need to say more. Shepard's face had the expression of a man who had learned, 5 years ago, to take Taylor's readings as operational intelligence. Data's anomalous contact resolved into a classification 11 seconds later. Single object. Cuboid geometry. Approximately 3 kilometers in each dimension. Dropping from subspace on a direct intercept heading, with an efficiency that indicated the approach vector had been calculated before the exit from warp, the entire deceleration arc pre-plotted, as if the object's navigation systems had known exactly where it was going since before it arrived. Power readings off every scale Data had catalogued for a single vessel. The subspace wake of its approach registered at the same order of magnitude as the ZPM output that had drawn it here, which was not a coincidence. The Borg did not approach coincidentally. On the Enterprise bridge, Data said, "It is broadcasting on all subspace frequencies simultaneously." He paused for 1 second, which was long enough. The main view screen resolved the cube's approach in visual range sensors. 3 kilometers of black geometric mass, no running lights, no exhaust signature, no thruster fire. It simply moved, the way things moved, when they had never needed to negotiate with anything in their path. "We are the Borg," Data said. Picard looked at the view screen. He looked at the cube for exactly the time it took to be certain of what he was seeing, and then he opened a channel to Starfleet Command. The impoundment order will need to wait. He closed the channel before Command could respond. He opened the Atlantis channel. "Colonel Shepard." "Yeah," Shepard said. "I see it too," Picard said. "I believe we need to reconsider the nature of our current arrangement." "Tell Worf to stand down his boarding party," Shepard said, "and I'll lower the field around the gate room so you can beam across." Neither man spent any time on what had just passed between them. There was a Borg cube on both their view screens, and it was not slowing down. The message came on every subspace frequency simultaneously, which was how the Borg announced themselves. "We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Resistance is futile." The cube did not maneuver. It held course and speed on a direct intercept heading, its approach vector calculated with the precision of something that had not needed to adjust for an obstacle in a very long time. 3 kilometers of black geometric mass, no running lights, no hesitation. From the Enterprise bridge, it was visible as a shape against the stars that the human eye kept trying to fit into a category it did not have. Picard stood at his command position and watched it come. He had been in this moment before, in a different configuration, and his body remembered it in a way that bypassed deliberate recall. The architecture of the targeting scan the cube was running on them. He knew its harmonic before data reported it. He stood with that knowledge for 3 seconds, held it apart from the decisions he needed to make, and then he was the captain again. He opened the channel to Atlantis. "They will not negotiate," he said. "They do not negotiate. The only language they speak is force, and there is no force Starfleet has fielded in 30 years of encountering them, that a single cube could not survive." Shepard's voice came back immediately. "What about the force this city can field?" "That," Picard said, "is what I need to know." Shepard was already moving. The control chair was in the lowest level of Atlantis's central tower, a chamber that the expedition had learned, in their first weeks in the Pegasus galaxy, to treat with something between respect and caution. The chair itself occupied the center of the room on a raised platform, a curved construction of ancient crystal and structural alloy that was not designed for the human body, but had been built to interface with one specific human attribute, the ATA gene. The ancient technology activation sequence that the ancients had threaded into a small number of human bloodlines before they left. Shepard had the strongest natural expression of that gene the expedition had ever recorded. The chair reclined the way it always did, like a thing making a decision about him rather than the other way around. The crystal surfaces along the armrests lit in the pale blue-gold of active ancient systems, and the warmth that moved up through the interface points in the chair was not biological and not mechanical, but something in the register between them, a current that the ATA gene translated. He had sat in this chair dozens of times. It never stopped feeling like the city recognizing him. He closed his eyes. On all 3 piers, the drone deployment platforms rose to full firing configuration. The first volley left Atlantis in a stream that the Enterprise's optical sensors registered as a river of light. Thousands of drones. They came off the platforms in continuous fire, each one a self-guided energy projectile, smaller than a human fist, each one reading its own path to the cube's structural failure points, the load-bearing joints where sections of the geometric mass connected. The coordination arrays embedded in the cube's upper faces, the ancients had designed them to find the places where a structure was most willing to fail, and the drones found those places the way water finds low ground. The cube did not adapt in the first 2 seconds. The first 2 seconds were devastating. Whole sections of the cube's exterior tore. Hull material that had processed 3 decades of Starfleet ordnance without yielding fractured, and came apart under drone impacts at 8 different points simultaneously. Power nodes went dark along the cube's port face. 2 of the coordination arrays on the upper structure detonated internally as the drones reached their cores. A section of the cube's lower mass, approximately 1/5 of the total volume, went completely black, its internal systems severed from the collective in the space of a single second. On the Enterprise bridge, Riker said something. It was quiet and involuntary, and he would not repeat it in any official report, but it was the honest response of someone watching something they had been assured was not possible. Worf stood up from his tactical station. He realized he had done it and sat back down. His expression did not change. The motion had happened anyway, At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, the next drone volley curved away from the cube's hull, not deflected by a physical barrier. Curved. The guidance frequency that the drones used to navigate to structural failure points had been read, catalogued, and reversed. The principle fed back into the collective's deflection field in an inversion that turned the drone's own targeting logic against them. A drone that had been angling toward the cube's secondary power core turned away from it and continued into empty space, traveling on a corrected path toward nothing. Then the next volley. Then the next. The sections of hull that had been torn open during the first 2 seconds were already beginning to close. Borg nano-reconstruction worked inward from the edges of the damage, the internal architecture repairing itself with the same absolute, impersonal efficiency. The collective applied to everything it did, the tiers sealed. The darkened nodes began, one by one, to come back online. The Enterprise fired photon torpedoes at the moving weak points, targeting the regenerating sections while they were still below full structural integrity. The first 3 shots detonated with effect. The collective catalogued the torpedo yield, the frequency of the detonation pattern, the targeting parameter the Enterprise's system was using to identify weak points. By the 4th shot, the hull had been selectively reinforced in the areas the Enterprise was targeting. By the 6th shot, the torpedoes were detonating against full-strength hull. Picard opened the channel. In the control chair, Shepard opened his eyes. The display around him showed drone after drone deflecting off the adapted field, each one curving away in the same arc, the same reversed guidance signature, the collective applying the same solution uniformly, because the drones were all using the same guidance frequency. He sat in the chair, with his city's weapons curving harmlessly into space, and understood exactly what he was looking at. "Yeah," he said, "I see it." Ronan was standing directly behind the chair. He had not spoken since Shepard sat down. His particle gun was in his hand. His face carried the expression of a man who has looked at something he has seen before in a different form, and recognized the specific shape of the problem. The cube's tractor emitter activated. The beam was not designed to pull a ship. It was designed to pull a section of a ship, to grip a defined area of hull, fix it in space relative to the cube, and allow a boarding party to match velocity and begin the assimilation process. The Borg did not destroy what they could use. They did not use force when acquisition would suffice. The beam locked onto a section of Atlantis's south pier. The ancient shield distributed the force across its entire surface, which was how ancient shields had been designed against this category of threat. The cube could not pull the city. The city did not move. But the power draw on the ZPM array climbed. McKay's voice came through the open channel from the operations room, precise and not particularly alarmed, which was the tone McKay used when he was very alarmed and had decided that projecting calm was more useful than projecting the alternative. The tractor is adding 12% to the ZPM draw. We can hold against it, K. But the shields are already running at elevated load from the approach tracking, and if the cube adds another tractor emitter, we go to 25% continuous drain, and I don't know how long we sustain that before the power curve becomes a problem I can't solve. In the control chair, Shepard looked at the drone display, and then at the power draw, and then at the cube on the tactical feed, still on its approach vector, still not in any hurry, because the Borg had learned that patience was simply a longer version of inevitability. They could not win this with weapons. The drones were the most powerful projectile weapons ever built by a civilization that had spanned 2 galaxies, and the Borg had adapted to them in 4.5 minutes. What they needed was something other than a weapon. He just did not yet know what that was. The ZPM drawer had been climbing for 19 minutes, and McKay had stopped pretending the curve was going to flatten on its own. He stood at the power management console in Atlantis's operations room and watched the numbers move. The tractor beam on the south pier had been joined by a second emitter pulling at the city's port approach shield, and the combined load was sitting at 31% of total ZPM output, which left 69% for shields, drone fire, and every other system keeping 200 people alive inside a city that a Borg cube was methodically preparing to board. The drone platforms were still firing. Each volley left the piers in the same luminous stream as the first, and each volley curved harmlessly away from the cube's adapted deflection field. The Enterprise was cycling phaser modulations at a rate Picard had described as faster than standard protocol, burning through the available spectrum faster than the system was rated for, and the Borg was adapting to each new modulation in under 60 seconds. They were doing everything they knew how to do. None of it was enough. McKay looked at the power curve and ran the math. 4 hours, maybe, before the ZPM drain reached the threshold where he would have to start making choices about which systems to keep running. He did not want to make those choices. He needed a different approach, and he had been, for the past 11 minutes, thinking about Wraith Queens. 5 years in Pegasus had taught McKay things about hive mind architecture that he had never intended to learn. The Wraith coordinated through their queens, a biological broadcast network that let the collective respond as a single organism across the entire theater of operation. When the expedition had found ways to sever that network, to cut the coordination signal at its source, the effects had been immediate and total. Wraith drones stopped responding to commands. Hive ships lost formation. Individual Wraith, cut off from the collective signal, became confused and slow. A distributed intelligence with a central coordination signal was at its core a signal, and a signal had a frequency, and a frequency could be disrupted. The Borg hive mind was not biological. It was technology-mediated, running on a subspace carrier wave that let billions of drones share the same consciousness in real time across interstellar distances. The mechanism was completely different. But McKay recognized the architecture. He had seen its shape before, in a different form, and the shape was what mattered. He found Data still working at the secondary console they had shared in the science lab, and put the question to him directly. Data had the answer already. The Enterprise's sensor archive includes the electromagnetic signature of the Borg coordination broadcast, Data said, including its subspace carrier frequency and the harmonic structure of its nested modulation tiers. I have previously identified this signal as a theoretical disruption target. The engineering obstacle is scale. Producing an interference pattern capable of severing the coordination link requires a transmission array significantly larger than the Enterprise's communications system. McKay looked at the ceiling, which was the direction of Atlantis's communications array, a system built at the dawn of a civilization that had spanned 2 galaxies when the Enterprise's civilization was still in its pre-industrial period. How much larger? The array aboard this city, Data said, would be sufficient. Picard beamed across 17 minutes later. He arrived in the Atlantis transporter bay alone, not as a representative. As a man who had been inside the thing they were trying to stop, and had survived to remember it. McKay met him at the door, and they moved toward the lab at a pace that did not waste time on preamble, because preamble was a resource McKay had already cut from his operational budget. Picard sat down across from McKay and Data at the lab bench. "When I was Locutus," he said, "I experienced the hive mind coordination signal directly. For approximately 18 hours, I was a node in the collective. I was aware of the architecture of the signal, its layers, its function distribution, the harmonic structure of each tier." He said it the way he had learned to say it over 7 years of living with the memory, as information. Not as a wound, or not primarily as one. "I was hoping that would be useful to you." McKay looked at him for 1 second. "Sit down and start talking." Picard had already sat down. He described the signal from the inside in the technical register he had developed over years of translating the experience into terms that could be used rather than simply endured. The coordination signal was not a single frequency. It was a cascade of nested harmonics, each layer responsible for a different tier of collective function. The deepest layer was motor and metabolic control. The basic keep the drones running signal that no disruption of the outer layers would reach. Above that was adaptive response, the tier that processed external sensory data and issued the specific modulation updates that made the Borg's adaptation so fast and so reliable. Above that was tactical coordination, the layer that synchronized offensive and defensive action across all drones within the local node. And above that, inaccessible to any individual drone, was the deeper hive intelligence itself. "If you sever the tactical coordination layer," Picard said, "the drones already deployed retain their existing programs. They keep whatever deflection fields they have established. But the collective cannot issue new adaptation instructions to the local node. The cube goes into a defensive holding pattern. It does not die. But its tactical responses stop updating. Data was already running the calculation. At full power, Atlantis's communications array broadcasting the interference pattern at the identified cascade frequency could sustain the disruption signal for approximately 7 minutes before the collective develops a countermodulation through alternate subspace channels. The doorway to the lab had been empty a moment before. It was not empty now. Shepard stood there, leaning against the frame with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had been listening for longer than he was going to say. He looked at Data. 7 minutes, he said. Yes, Data said. However, if the cube's adaptive response is frozen at its current configuration, your drone weapons will re-engage at full effectiveness. The cube's hull at its current damaged state would require approximately 90 seconds of concentrated fire to reach catastrophic structural failure. Shepard looked at McKay. McKay said, "You'll have 5.5 minutes left over." "Then, what's the catch?" Shepard said. McKay pulled up the power management screen and turned it toward him. Running the communications array at this power level while maintaining city shields means drawing from all 3 ZPMs simultaneously at a rate the system was not designed to sustain continuously. We will lose 1 ZPM entirely during the broadcast window, not damaged, gone, burned to exhaustion. He let that land. We go into whatever comes after this on 2 ZPM. And the Borg Collective will have a complete recording of exactly what just happened to their cube and how we did it. Shepard looked at the power curve. It was still climbing. "Is there another option?" he said. "There's always another option," McKay said. "The other option is we run out of power in about 4 hours, and then they board us and we find out what assimilation feels like from the wrong end." Shepard looked at the cube on the tactical feed on the wall screen. It was still advancing, slow and certain, the tractor emitters pulling at the city's shields with the patience of something that had never learned to hurry because hurrying had never been necessary. "Fire it up," he said. 3 minutes before the broadcast, the Borg cube was close enough to see without magnification. Shepard and Picard stood at the observation deck windows, while McKay and Data ran final calibration on the communications array 2 decks below. Their voices audible as a steady technical exchange over the open comm channel that Shepard had left running so he could hear if anything went wrong. The cube filled the upper left quadrant of the viewport, 3 kilometers of black geometric mass, close enough now that the individual structural features of its surface were distinguishable as recessed channels and protrusions whose function was not decorative. The tractor emitters on the cube's forward face were running at sustained output. 2 of the pier shields were lit with a continuous amber notation on the tactical overlay, indicating sustained external load. Picard was watching the cube. He said, "You told me the Borg would have found this galaxy eventually. That may be true, but they found it now. Following your signal, the timeline accelerated because of your arrival." "Yeah," Shepard said. "I don't." Shepard looked at the cube. "I brought a Borg cube to your galaxy. I also brought the only thing in your galaxy that hurt it." Picard was quiet for a moment. He did not dispute that either. "And if I told you that what you brought, the ZPM technology, the drone weapons, the knowledge of what you have fought, will permanently change this civilization's development in ways neither of us can predict, would you accept responsibility for that?" Shepard thought about it for the time it took to watch one last drone volley curve harmlessly away from the cube's adapted field. "I accept responsibility for still being alive. Everything else is a complication I'll deal with." Picard said, "That is the exact answer I expected." "Is it wrong?" Shepard said. Picard was quiet for 3 seconds. The cube held its position in the viewport, enormous and certain, the tractor emitters pulling at the city in the steady, impersonal way of a machine that did not have a concept of being refused. 3 seconds was long enough for Shepard to understand that the silence was not evasion. It was the sound of a man who had spent 30 years knowing the answer to questions, like this one arriving in the very specific context of this moment at genuine uncertainty. "I genuinely don't know," Picard said. "And I have never in 30 years of command said those words and meant them as completely as I mean them now." The cube made a small adjustment in its approach vector. Neither of them commented on it. "When the Wraith came for your people," Picard said, "the Federation was not there. I was not there. The rule I have spent my career defending would have told me not to go. I would have followed the rule, and the people you saved would not have been saved." He was not recanting. His voice carried none of the register of a man abandoning a position. He was acknowledging precisely, without sentimentality, what the position cost. Shepard looked at him. "I know what it costs to follow a rule like that. I've watched people follow the IOA's version, and I've watched people die waiting for it. I'm not saying you were wrong to build that rule. I'm saying I was right not to follow it. They did not agree, they understood each other. In the specific context of a viewport showing a Borg cube with 2 minutes left before the weapon fired, that was enough." McKay's voice came through the comm. "The array is calibrated. Power levels are nominal. I want to note for the record that I've done more impressive things in worse conditions, but this is somewhere in the top 5. A beat. Ready when you are." Shepard looked at Picard. Picard said, "The Enterprise will begin its torpedo run the moment the cube's deflectors show any change in configuration." "Then get back to your ship," Shepard said. Picard moved toward the transporter bay. At the door, he stopped, turned back briefly, and looked at Shepard with the expression of a man filing something to memory. He said nothing. Neither did Shepard. Then Picard was gone, and Shepard was moving. The control chair lit when he sat down in it, the ATA interface warming through the armrests, with the recognition that the city had never stopped extending toward him since the first time he had ever sat in its counterpart in Antarctica, half a galaxy and a different universe away. He did not close his eyes this time. He looked at the cube on the tactical display, found the 3 deployment platforms already at full configuration, and gave the order. "Fire the array," he said. Below, in the science lab, McKay engaged the broadcast. Atlantis's communications array, a system built by people who had used it to coordinate city ships across the span of 2 galaxies, redirected its full transmission power to the specific cascade frequency that Pickard had described from the inside and Data had calculated from the outside. The subspace interference field hit the cube at the speed of light, and then faster, propagating through the subspace layer where the Borg's coordination signal ran. The adaptation stopped, not slowed. The tactical coordination tier of the hive mind's local signal, the layer that issued new countermeasure updates and distributed adaptation instructions to every drone in the engagement theater, went silent as if a switch had been opened. The deflection fields around the cube locked, in their current configuration, unchanged, no longer updating, the frozen record of where the Borg's adaptive logic had arrived before the signal died. The drone volley Shepard launched a half-second later was the first volley in 23 minutes that reached the cube's hull. The drones found the structural failure points with the same certainty as the opening volley. They came in at angles the frozen deflection configuration had not been set to cover, threading through gaps in the adapted field geometry that the collective could see and could not fix because the instruction pathway was severed. The river of light from Atlantis's 3 piers hit the cube across every quadrant simultaneously, and sections that had already been damaged in the first 2 seconds of the engagement and had been regenerating ever since came apart again. This time without the nano-constructors having enough time to respond before the next impact reached the same coordinates. On the Enterprise, Picard said, "Fire everything." Proton torpedoes went into the structural junctions, the drone fire opened. The first 3 hits detonated against exposed internal architecture. The 4th hit a power distribution node that served the cube's remaining tractor emitters. All 3 emitters went dark simultaneously, and the load on Atlantis's pier shields dropped to 0. The cube did not explode, it came apart. 1 section at a time, each falling dark as its power nodes lost continuity with the rest of the structure. The largest piece, the port forward quarter, separated and began a slow rotation, its internal lights going out from one end to the other. The smaller sections collapsed along lines of structural failure that the drone guidance had been working toward for 24 minutes. In under 90 seconds, the Borg cube was a debris field. McKay's voice came through the comm at 6 minutes and 40 seconds, flat with the specific quality of a man who had been running a countdown and had reached a number he was satisfied with. 6 minutes 40 seconds. The broadcast array powered down. The interference signal stopped. The subspace layer where the Borg coordination signal ran was quiet. 1 ZPM was gone. The other 2 read at 81 and 79%. The Enterprise was intact. Data's voice came through on the open channel 14 seconds after the last section of the cube went dark. "I am detecting a final subspace transmission that originated from the cube's primary communication node in the last 4 seconds before that section lost power." A brief pause. The transmission was outbound. Its content includes the complete tactical record of this engagement, the ZPM power signature, the interference pattern's frequency and cascade architecture, and the positional coordinates of this sector. "Where was it going?" Shepard said. "The destination vector," Data said, "is consistent with the known location of Borg space." The debris field turned slowly in the starlight. 3 kilometers of Borg cube disassembled into components that the collective would never rebuild from this location. Atlantis's shields ran at normal load. The pier weapons platform stood at standby. The Enterprise held position 2 kilometers off the port approach, its running lights steady in the dark. The battle was over. The record of it was already on its way home. The debris field was still expanding when McKay ran the numbers. He ran them in the operations room with his tablet propped against the power management console and the tactical display showing the cube's remains spreading slowly across a 3-kilometer radius of space that had, approximately 40 minutes ago, been occupied by the most dangerous single vessel in this galaxy. The math was not complicated. 2 ZPMs at 81 and 79%. Combined sustainable output sufficient for full shield operations, full star drive, life support, weapons systems, and every secondary system aboard for several months without any additional power draw. The city could move. The city could defend itself. What the city could not do was go home. The dimensional transit had required 3 fully charged ZPMs, and apparently something else. An external influence on the subspace corridor geometry that the transit event data described without identifying a nudge from outside the transit itself. They did not have that factor. They did not have the 3rd ZPM. They did not have a Stargate network in this universe. They had 2 ZPMs, a functioning star drive, and a galaxy that was not theirs. McKay filed the numbers and opened the next file. The impoundment order was rescinded within the hour. Starfleet Command's subspace relay had been active throughout the engagement. Every flag officer who had signed the impoundment directive had watched a Borg cube, the vessel class that destroyed 39 ships at Wolf 359, come apart in under 90 seconds. The relay had recorded all of it, the interference broadcast, the ZPM readings before and after, and Data's report about the outbound transmission from the cube's last active node. The rescission arrived without explanation. The document simply no longer had the status it had carried an hour before. Picard received the notification at his command chair, read it, and set it aside in the manner of a man who had expected this outcome and found nothing celebratory in being correct. He drafted his recommendation to the Federation Council on the record. The Atlantis expedition was not a threat, not a vessel, and not a subject for Federation law. They were human beings in possession of technology that had just prevented a Borg assimilation event in Federation space with a history and a culture that this civilization had no legitimate claim to absorb or override. His recommendation was a provisional status. Allied installation, non-member, with full autonomy over the city ship and no obligation to share any technology, intelligence or operational data that the expedition had not chosen voluntarily to share. He supported the recommendation with one sentence, placed last, which he had found in his experience to be the most effective position for the sentence a council needed to hear. They could have refused to help. They chose not to. Taylor delivered the expedition's response. She stood in the operations room in front of Picard's transmitted image with the posture she carried into every diplomatic exchange, which was the posture of someone who had been the only bridge between her people and the rest of Pegasus for 30 years and had learned to stand in that position. Shepard was in the chair room running through the post-engagement weapons diagnostics, which was his way of accounting for things after a battle. He had asked Taylor to speak for the expedition, which was not an abdication. It was a recognition of what she was better at than him. "We are not refugees," Taylor said, "and we are not applicants. We are explorers who ended up in the wrong universe. We will accept your recognition of our autonomy because it is accurate, not because we required your permission for it." Picard looked at her for a moment. His expression held the specific quality of someone who had expected a counterpart with teeth and had found one. "That is entirely fair," he said. Taylor was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet before she said something she had decided to say. "We are also, for what it is worth, grateful that you exist in our galaxy. We did not have the kind of help we just received. Not once in 5 years. We had allies. We had made ourselves. We did not have a civilization that met us as equals in the first 2 hours." She paused. "That is not a small thing," Picard said. "No, it is not." In the science lab, McKay and Data were still working. They had been running through the engagement data since the broadcast powered down, building a complete tactical record of what had worked and what had not, and why, because both of them were constitutionally incapable of stopping before the record was complete. McKay had pulled up the Wraith Queen engagement files from the expedition's 2nd year, the specific operations in which severing the Queen's broadcast network had produced the disorientation and dormancy in drone populations that the coordination signal disruption had produced in the Borg. Data examined the comparison. He said, "The mechanism is entirely different. Wraith coordination is biological. Borg coordination is technological. Yet, the architectural principle is sufficiently analogous that the Wraith experience provided the conceptual framework for the solution." A brief pause. "I find that remarkable. It means all hive minds have the same vulnerability," McKay said. "The strength and the weakness are the same thing." "You're only as coordinated as your coordination signal," Data said. "Fighting something that hives." For 5 years, McKay looked at the Wraith file for a moment. He answered honestly, which was not his default mode in conversations that touched on the years in Pegasus, but Data had been honest with him consistently, and the lab felt like the kind of place where the exchange rate was fixed. "It was like fighting something that doesn't know it can lose," he said. "Not because it's stupid, because it's right, usually. It's been winning for 10,000 years. Changing that math required convincing the universe that the math was wrong, and the universe doesn't care about your argument." "You succeeded," Data said. "Partially. We changed the math in some sectors. The Wraith still exist." McKay leaned back. "The difference between the Wraith and the Borg is that the Wraith are hungry. The Borg aren't. The Wraith want something. The Borg just execute." He considered this. Execution, you can only survive. Data was quiet for a moment. "We should work on making sure this place knows how to survive it," McKay said. "The cube sent its data home. Whatever comes next, they'll know what we did." Ronan was on the south pier. He stood at the outer railing where the pier met the shield boundary and looked at the debris field. 3 kilometers of Borg cube, broken into components that were not going to reassemble. He had not fired his particle gun during the engagement. There had been nothing for it to fire at. He had stood in the chair room behind Shepard and held his weapon the way he always held it in situations where the weapon was not the solution. Steadily, at rest, ready for a moment that did not come. 7 years as a runner had produced in Ronan a very clear accounting system. He knew what he had before an engagement and what he had after it, and the subtraction between those 2 states was the cost, and the cost was either payable or it was not. The city was not dead. 2 ZPMs, no way home, a Borg collective somewhere in this galaxy's far reaches, with a complete record of what Atlantis had done to their cube. He had been stranded before. He had been without a way home before. He had survived 7 years of that math alone, in a galaxy full of things that wanted to drain the years out of him, without a city, without a team, without anyone at his back who was going to still be there in the morning. The team was still there, the city was still there, the math was different. Ronan looked at the debris field for a while. Then he looked at the stars in the direction the Borg transmission had gone, which was a direction the sensors had identified and he had memorized, because knowing where a threat was coming from was a habit he had never broken. He was not afraid of that direction. He was aware of it. Those were different things. The pier lights ran steady along the railing behind him. The city was quiet, in the specific way of a thing that had absorbed a battle and was still standing. Ronan stood at the edge of it and did his accounting, and found that the number came out the same as it always did. Still here. Still breathing, still in it. For now, that was enough. It had always been enough. 3 days after the Borg cube became a debris field, Starfleet sent 2 additional ships to the sector. They were not there to contain Atlantis. That window had passed at the 6-minute and 40-second mark of the engagement. The ships were there because the Borg cube's outbound transmission had been logged, which meant that somewhere between here and the far reaches of Borg territory, 39 other cubes now had a subspace packet in their collective memory that had not been there 4 days ago. Nobody in this galaxy pretended that a Borg transmission with new data was a comfortable thing to have logged, and Starfleet responded, the way it responded to discomfort, by sending ships. Picard was on Atlantis' central tower when the second ship dropped out of warp at the edge of the sector, its registry lights identifying it to long-range sensors before its hailing frequency came through. Shepard had invited him up in the way Shepard issued invitations, which was by mentioning that the tower had a better view than the transporter room and leaving the implication where it could be picked up or left alone. Picard had picked it up. They stood at the railing in the quiet that had developed between them over 3 days of proximity, the quiet of 2 people who had argued something fully and had not resolved it, and had arrived at the mutual understanding that the absence of resolution. Below them, the city spread outward on its 3 piers, its lights running steady, the debris field of the Borg cube, visible on the southern sensor display as a scatter of material that had been catalogued and was not of immediate tactical concern. Picard said, "Your people built a civilization on fighting those who called themselves gods. Mine built one on refusing to need gods." He was not making an argument. He was noting a pattern that he had been turning over for 3 days. "I wonder sometimes if those are the same project." Shepard looked at the starfield for a moment. "Yeah, except ours involved a lot more P90s, Picard said. "Yes, there is that." They stood in companionable quiet for another few minutes. On the sensor display, the second Starfleet ship was settling into a holding position at the edge of the sector's designated safety perimeter, its warp field powering down with the routine precision of a vessel that had done this many times and had no particular feelings about it. Shepard had been thinking about something for 3 days. He found the phrasing for it now, not in words, but in the decision it produced. He had spent 5 years furious at the ancients, beings of pure energy who had built this city, and then left the people of Pegasus to be farmed alive rather than intervene, on principle, because intervention by transcended beings was not how the universe was supposed to work. He had built his entire operational philosophy in opposition to that choice. Picard would have made the same choice. And looking at him now, 3 days after a battle that the principle had very nearly prevented them from winning together, Shepard understood for the first time that it was not cowardice. It was a man carrying a cost willingly, because he believed the cost was worth it. Shepard did not agree, but he understood. He opened his comm to the operations room. "Tell the Federation survey team. They can have access to the star drive specifications and the communications array architecture. Everything they asked for in the last 3 days." He paused. "Not the ZPM manufacturing process. Not the drone guidance system. What I said." McKay's voice came back with the tone of a man who had already been preparing to argue against a broader share and found himself disarmed. "Okay." Shepard closed the comm and looked at the starfield. Crest materialized in the center of Atlantis' command room at the moment that Picard and Shepard stepped off the tower lift. Mid-sentence in a conversation McKay was having with Data about the frequency architecture of the Borg countermodulation development, which was not a conversation that benefited from interruption. The flash of white light was total and casual, the kind of entrance that announced nothing except that the being making it had never felt the need to knock. Q looked around the room. The ancient crystal architecture. The Stargate ring, standing in its chamber, unused, connected to a network that did not exist in this universe. The exhausted humans at their stations, the android reviewing a tactical data file, the Satadan in the corner with his hand near a weapon that would not have helped against Q in any configuration. His expression was, briefly, something close to genuine feeling. With Q, it was always hard to be certain. He did not look at Picard. He looked at Shepard. "I have tested 12,000 species, give or take for potential," Q said. "Most of them fail the basic test before they get interesting. A few manage to be interesting and then stop." He tilted his head slightly. "Your people have been fighting beings that called themselves gods since before the first one of them knew what a god was. They are still fighting. That is either very admirable or very stubborn, and I genuinely cannot tell the difference, which is, I confess, rare for me." Shepard said, "Are you going to send us home?" Q said I could. "Will you not today?" Questier looked at the Stargate ring for a moment, then back. "You are in a universe that has the Borg and the Q and 39 cubes that just received a subspace packet with your address in it. And you decided to stay." "We didn't decide anything," Shepard said. "We're stranded." "Oh, Colonel," Q said, "everyone is stranded somewhere. The question is what you do while you wait." He was gone. The light did not linger. The command room held the sound of the ventilation system and the soft data processing chirp of ancient crystal matrices and the collective non-response of a room full of people who had been through enough in the past 4 days that even Q's departure registered. McKay said, "I hate him," without particular emphasis. Somewhere in the deep space between the Devron system and Borg territory, 39 cubes received a subspace packet. They did not accelerate. They did not alter their existing assignments. The collective simply updated its priority queue. The entry added to 39 cubes simultaneously was not in any language any human in either universe would recognize, but its content was precise. 0-point vacuum energy, new origin, origin designate, extra-dimensional. Assimilation priority, maximum, 39 cubes. The queue was very long. The Borg were not in a hurry. Atlantis held its position 3 light-years from the Devron system, in the contested approach to the Romulan neutral zone, in a galaxy that did not know its name, 3 ZPMs, 2 at 80%, shields at minimal load, weapons at standby, the star drive warm and ready, the communications array powered down to maintenance level after the strain of the broadcast. The Wraith were in another universe. The Goa'uld were in another universe, the ancients were in another universe, not intervening, which was at least consistent. Picard's galaxy had the Borg and the Q, and the principle that proved your worth by what you refused to do with power. The Atlantis crew had 5 years of evidence that refusing sometimes meant watching people die. Both things were true. Both things would remain true. The universe had not been asked to resolve them, and had not done so. Shepard sat in the command chair at the top of the central tower. The chair was built for beings who had transcended physical existence, and every time he sat in it, without exception, it felt like it had been built for him. The city hummed around him the way a city hums when it is occupied and lit and maintained by people who have decided, without ever making a formal decision, to keep it alive. The lights ran along all 3 piers. The shields held their shape against the dark. The city held its position, for now. Okay, I did no just drop you in the middle of a crossover and walk away. Did the ending land for you? Drop your verdict in the comments. I want to know if you think the Atlantis crew should stay in the Star Trek universe, or if Q should have just sent them home. Also, what's the next universe you want Atlantis dropped into? Leave your answer below, because the next video is literally going to be decided by what you all vote on. Like this video if you want more of these crossovers, subscribe so you don't miss the next one,